On the night of the 22nd of September 2006, Cassie Jo Stoddart was house sitting for her aunt and uncle, who had asked her would she mind watching the family pets over the weekend, 3 cats and 2 dogs. The house was situated on Whispering Cliffs Drive in northeast Bannock Country in Idaho. At around 6 PM that night, Cassie's boyfriend Matt Beckham arrived to keep her company. Later that evening, 2 other classmates arrived at the house to hang out, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk, who were both 16 at the time, the same as Cassie and Matt. Once inside the house, they were given the grand tour, which included the basement area, before the 14s decided to head into the living room and sit and watch a movie, which was Kill Bill Volume 2, a very violent, bloodthirsty movie to say the least. But Brian and Tori were fine with this. They love violent, gory movies, especially slasher movies, movies involving terror and murder, movies like John Carpenter's Halloween or Wes Craven's Scream. In hindsight, this was most definitely an unhealthy obsession with horror movies. In fact, that is exactly how the 2 teenagers came together in the first place, when they discovered that they actually had a great deal in common with their fascination for bloodlust. In fact, ever since they met, they had decided that they wanted to take not one life, but many. They obsessed with killing, obsessed with the sensation of taking someone else's life. They wanted nothing more. In the weeks leading up to this night, they had actually made a kill list of all their victims, various school friends, writing down plans of attack, plans that most likely were not from the most stable and sane minds, but plans nonetheless. They actually kept a kind of video diary talking about killing, about how they would do it. In fact, Cassie Jo Stoddart actually made an appearance at one point in one of their sick videos. They also liked to justify why it was okay to kill in these videos, saying things such as murder is only illegal because society made it that way, and it's not really evil, although they knew full well that they both were very evil indeed, and they revelled in the fact.
There should be no law against killing people. I know it's a wrong thing, but hell, you restrict somebody from it, they're gonna want it more.
They would discuss their favourite serial killers, and the list wasn't that extensive. They seemed to try hard, trying in vain to sound wise and clever, leaving a video document that would be shown after their murder spree, a video that would become as famous as they were. It wasn't, and isn't. It's actually become a thing of sadness and ridicule, showing, and I can't state this enough, just how dim-witted these 2 actually were, and absolutely evil and twisted to the core. And they absolutely accepted who they were, and there's no doubt about that. It was very clear in the videotapes. They knew what they wanted to do, and nothing was going to stop them, not even if they had to kill a friend. The first victim was to be a young girl, a school friend who they had discovered was to be home alone on this very night, but for some reason, that plan fell through. The next on their list was Cassie Jo Stoddart, who they also knew was going to be home alone, while she looked after her aunt and uncle's house for the weekend. And in their own words, it was perfect.
We found our victim, and sad as it may be, she's our friend. But you know what? We all have to make sacrifices. Our first victim is going to be Cassie Stoddart. She's going to be alone in a big, dark house out in the middle of nowhere. How perfect can you get? I mean, like, holy shit, dude.
I'm horny just thinking about it.
Hell yeah.
The movie they had chose was not holding their attention. Maybe it was the thought of the kill ahead of them that made them eager to get up and leave, explaining to Matt and Cassie that they were going to head off and catch a movie at the movie theatre. They both left the house, but not before unlocking the back door at some point, so they could let themselves back in when they returned in costumes brandishing knives with intent to kill. They left the house and headed to the car and drove a short distance down the street and parked. It was there that they dressed in dark black clothing, with gloves to conceal fingerprints, finished off with white creepy plastic masks. Masks that resembled an expressionless face with fake blood around the eye sockets and mouth. A truly horrifying sight to behold. A look that wasn't unlike the killer's mask in the Scream movies, minus the blood. They also had knives upon them, knives that had been purchased from a pawn shop after convincing one of their friends to purchase the weapons for them. After all, they were only 16, far too young to buy knives from a pawn shop.
I mean, like, holy shit, dude.
I'm horny just thinking about it.
Hell yeah. It was 9:50, September 22nd, 2006. We know there's lots of doors. There's lots of places to hide. I locked the back doors, so it's all locked. Now we just gotta wait.
They both made their way back towards the house and let themselves in the back door, which they unlocked earlier, which led into the basement. whilst Cassie and Matt remained upstairs oblivious. After a short while, Tori and Brian started to make noises in the basement. A bang here, a crash there, anything to try and bring Cassie or Matt down to the basement. They'd not actually wanted to kill Matt. Cassie was a target, but they both decided that if Matt was to get in the way of their plans for Cassie, then they didn't have a problem killing him also. And if that was the way it had to go down, they didn't have a problem with it. They carried on making noise, trying in vain to get their attention, but ultimately this failed. The only attention they got was from one of the dogs that stood at the top of the stairs that led down into the basement, looking very confused, but refusing to venture down. It was at this point that Tori and Brian noticed a circuit box on the wall that controlled the power to the house, and they decided to pull the power, hoping that Matt or Cassie would venture down to the basement to fix the problem. Sometimes flicking the lights on and off randomly before shutting it off again. It must have really looked like a house of horrors in the imaginative mind of a teen. And I can understand why they didn't venture into the basement in the dark, because what's the number one rule in a horror movie? You never ever venture into the basement, although they always seem to. Nevertheless, all of this strange activity was starting to scare Cassie, who had to stay in this house overnight alone with only the pets to keep her company. So Matt rang his mother to ask if he was allowed to stay the night with Cassie to keep her company. Of course, Matt's mother refused. The thought of two teenagers alone in a house is probably not the most comforting of thoughts for a mother to have, and she told him no, and to get ready because she was coming over to collect him. He was to come home. When his mother arrived at the house, she offered Cassie the opportunity to stay over at her house under her supervision, but a brave Cassie refused. She had a responsibility to look after the house and the animals, and she didn't want to let her aunt and uncle down. The lights had started to work again, so maybe the problem had fixed itself. At around 10 PM, as Matt left Cassie alone for the night, he rang Tori and Brian to explain that he couldn't meet up with them, and he had left Cassie's house, leaving her totally alone. Matt later recalled that Tori was whispering down the phone. At the time he thought it was because they were at the movies, when in reality they were still in the basement waiting for their moment. Once Cassie was alone, the two teens continued to trip the power and make noises from the basement. I can only imagine the fear Cassie must have felt. Eventually they got bored of trying to get Cassie to come down into the basement and decided to make their way up to the living area of the house, but not before pulling the plug one last time, plunging the house into darkness. Whilst Cassie sat alone on the couch in total darkness, they ascended the stairs, banging and slamming doors to scare Cassie. They made their way into the living room where Cassie was huddled on the couch, probably frozen in fear, unable to move. I've heard other versions where Cassie jumped to her feet, but ultimately and sadly both versions result in the same outcome. Cassie was violently and viciously stabbed 30 times, 12 of which were fatal. She had wounds on her chest, throat, back and abdomen, and had several defensive wounds to her hands and arms. She didn't stand a chance, as both boys repeatedly stabbed her to death, Brian using a dagger-like blade whilst Tori wielded a hunting knife. The two boys then fled the house in a complete panic, driving to an isolated spot to attempt to burn and bury the evidence, including the masks, knives and videotapes.
Just killed Cassie. We just left her house. This is not a fucking joke.
I'm shaking.
I stabbed her in the throat and I saw her lifeless body just disappear. Dude, I just killed Cassie. Oh, fuck. That felt like fucking real. I mean, it went by so fast.
Shut the fuck up. We gotta get our act straight.
Okay.
And then they simply went back to Tori's house to relax and watch a movie, content that they had gotten away with murder. It would be 2 days before Cassie's body was discovered, and sadly she was actually found by the family's 13-year-old daughter, who entered the house first, to find Cassie's body lying on the floor by the couch in a pool of her own blood, and the blood was everywhere, on the carpet, on the furniture and sprayed up the walls, showing how frenzied the attack must have been. The sight must have been horrific. The police quickly went to work. The first suspect was of course the boyfriend, and Cassie's boyfriend had been Matt. Matt was brought in for questioning, and he was more than happy to help clear his name, offering to take a lie detector test as well as going over everything that had occurred on that fateful night. Matt was quickly taken off the list of suspects. After all, his alibi was airtight. But when Brian and Tori were questioned, it became abundantly clear that their story was full of holes. They both said that they were at the movie theatre at the time of the murder, but when they were asked to describe the movie they had seen, they simply couldn't. They had no idea of the plot. Also, they were nowhere to be seen on the CCTV footage from the movie theatre. Even the staff at the theatre had no recollection of seeing the two boys. This included an employee who worked at the theatre who also attended the same school. The story just didn't hold up. But the two teens had a backup plan. If the theatre story failed, they would simply change the story, and they would claim that they were out stealing from cars. They didn't want to reveal this at first because they were afraid that they would be given jail time. Or so they said. Of course, this was also a lie. The police could see straight through the lies. These two were simply not as clever as they believed, and the lies were simply not fooling anybody. Brian was the first to break under the pressure, claiming that Tori had made him inflict some of the fatal wounds on Cassie, but once again, they could see straight through these lies. The buried evidence was recovered, which included the knives, masks, gloves and videotapes, which were still watchable despite the miserable attempt at burning the evidence. The police already had the confessions, but footage from the tapes certainly wouldn't hurt the case against the two killers. On April the 17th, 2007, Brian was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, and on the 8th of June 2007, Tori was given the same verdict. And they are now both behind bars serving life sentences despite many appeals that they have filled, but I'm glad to say each one has been unsuccessful and denied. These two really did believe that they would go down in history just like some of the big hitters, the big name serial killers such as Ted Bundy and the Zodiac Killer. But I have no doubt instead they will be long forgotten in time as they serve their sentences. But the memory of a pleasant, curving, shy young girl named Cassie shall live on forever. On Halloween night in 1974 in Deer Park, Texas, the streets were alive with excited children going from door to door asking, "Trick or treat." Ronald Clark O'Brien was out walking the streets with his two children, Timothy and Elizabeth. He was also accompanied by his next door neighbour and his two children. The children ran up to a house and proceeded to knock, buckets at the ready to collect whatever candy was given to them. But after a few attempts at knocking, it became obvious no one was home. So the neighbour and all the four children rushed off to the next house, leaving O'Brien behind, where he lingered for a while. Eventually he caught up with the group and revealed 5 pixie sticks that had apparently been handed to him by the previous house, who answered the door just as they left. He gave one each to his children and the neighbour's children, and later gave the 5th candy to a young boy who he recognised from church. Unknown to his neighbour and children, that O'Brien had sabotaged the candy and laced it all with potassium cyanide. Later that night in the O'Brien house, Timothy asked if he could eat some of his candy. He picked up the pixie sticks and proceeded to open the wrapper, but was struggling. His father helped him. He opened the packet of candy and handed it back to his son, and stood back and watched Timothy pour the powdery candy down his throat and seal his fate. Timothy complained about the bitter taste, so his father gave him a drink to wash it down. It wasn't long before Timothy started to complain of stomach pains. He rushed to the bathroom where he vomited and then started to convulse. The 8-year-old then went limp in his father's arms and died in the ambulance on the way to hospital. The autopsy found the laced candy in the little boy's system. There was enough to kill 2 grown adults. The authorities quickly rounded up all of the candy in the area, especially looking for any pixie sticks. Luckily, Elizabeth and the neighbour's children had not eaten the candy, and it was recovered from them. The parents of the 5th child, the boy from church, had been found fast asleep in his bed with the pixie sticks in his hand, unopened. Luckily, he had been unable to open the candy and had fallen asleep whilst trying to unwrap it. At this time, O'Brien was not a suspect, but it was just a matter of time before police grew suspicious. Police started to show suspicion after finding out O'Brien didn't visit that many houses on Halloween night, and the ones he did visit didn't seem to be handing out any pixie sticks. O'Brien was also found to have given false information to the police. He stated that the house they knocked on, the house with no answer, eventually opened the door after his neighbours and the children left for the next house. He told police the gentleman behind the door handed him 5 pixie sticks and then shut the door. The house belonged to a Mr. Courtney Melvin, who worked as an air traffic controller, and on Halloween night he was at work, only arriving home around 11 PM. He also had over 200 witnesses to confirm this, giving him the all clear and ruling him out as a suspect. Becoming more and more suspicious of O'Brien, the police did a bit more digging into his personal finances and discovered he was over $100,000 in debt. They also discovered that he had taken out life insurance on his 2 children and had increased the payout a few times leading up to Halloween. It was also discovered that the day after his 8-year-old's death, he had rang up the insurance company to make a claim on his deceased son. As if this wasn't enough, the police also discovered that O'Brien had tried to purchase some cyanide from a local chemical factory. But in the end he didn't bother because the factory only sold in large quantities. To this day it is not known where exactly he purchased the cyanide from. The police joined the dots, and on November the 5th, 1974 they arrested O'Brien, who pleaded not guilty. The evidence continued to mount up. Many people testified, including workers from the chemical factory and O'Brien's work colleagues, who claimed for almost a year he had obsessed over cyanide, researching it endlessly and often discussing its effects on a person and how much it would take of the substance to kill someone. O'Brien's stepsister also testified, stating that O'Brien talked about claiming the money from his son's insurance and boasting about buying things and going away on a vacation. The jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death on the 23rd of June 1975. O'Brien's wife later filed for divorce and remarried. Her new husband adopted Elizabeth, and they all started a new life together under a new name. O'Brien's time in prison was not pleasant. The prisoners did not like child killers, and they made it known. After many delays, O'Brien's execution finally went through on March the 31st, 1984 by lethal injection. Outside there was a crowd of over 300 people, and once the news broke out, they all cheered and threw candy at anti-death penalty demonstrators whilst shouting, "Trick or treat," over and over again. We all love a good spooky story at Halloween, but sometimes the most sickening and saddening are the true ones. I'm going to take you back to 1948, the place Somerton Beach, which is south of Adelaide, the capital city of South Australia. Our true story starts at 7 PM on the 30th of November, which was a very pleasant warm Tuesday evening. Jeweller John Bain Lyons and his wife went for a stroll on the beach, which is something they often like to do if the weather was nice enough, and on this particular summer's day it was very nice. As they walked a little further down the beach, they noticed a well-dressed man lying on the sand, his head propped against the sea wall near the foot of some steps that led down to the beach. According to John and his wife, he looked very drunk, although he was around 20 yards away from them at the time, his legs outstretched in front of him and his feet crossed. I imagine he looked quite relaxed. The couple continued their walk while still watching the man. The man then raised his left arm before letting it fall back down to the ground. John would later say in his statement it looked as though the man was making some kind of drunken effort to smoke a cigarette. Quite convinced that the man was nothing but drunk, they carried on with their walk. Half an hour later, another couple walked past the man. At this time, the sun was beginning to go down and the street lights come on in preparation for darkness. The couple had the man in their sights for almost half an hour and didn't see any movement at all, but could not be certain if the well-dressed man had changed position or not when they were not looking. In fact, they actually commented that the man may be dead, as he was not reacting to the mosquitoes that were now all around him. They come to the conclusion that it was more likely he was asleep and decided to leave him be, and they carried on with their evening. The next morning at around 6:50 AM, as John Lyons, the gentleman who spotted the well-dressed man sat on the beach whilst walking with his wife, returned from a morning swim in the sea. As he walked back up the beach, he noticed that a crowd had gathered around the same area that he had seen the man the night before. As he approached the crowd, he noticed that the man was still sat there by the rocks, but now it was quite clear to see that the man was dead. His body was now slumped, but still had his feet crossed and pointed towards the sea, and he was cold to the touch. On his collar rested a half-smoked cigarette, as though it had fallen from his lips. But here's the thing, there was absolutely no sign of violence, no blood, no bruising, nothing. It would seem that this gentleman had just simply sat down on the beach and passed away. But as the investigations into this man's death went on, it became obvious that there was a whole lot more to this story than met the eye. A mystery wrapped in an enigma. On today's episode of Bizarre Tales, we're going to look into the case of the unknown man who died on that beach in 1948, and still to this day his identity remains unknown, and has become known as simply the Somerton Man. After the police arrived and some pictures were taken of the body right there on the beach, it was taken to the Royal Adelaide Hospital, and it was there that Dr. John Berkeley Bennett suggested that the time of death would have been around 2 a.m, and he put it down to heart failure. But here is where it gets strange. He also suspected that the man may have been poisoned, which was also strange because there was no vomit, something that normally occurs after being poisoned, the body's own way of flushing out anything harmful. Another thing the police were missing was a name for this man, as he had no wallet or ID. The man himself looked like he was very physically fit and looked athletic, with broad shoulders, and he had grey eyes. He was also around 5 foot 11 inches tall. His hair was a mousy ginger colour, turning grey on the sides and behind the ears, and slicked back, a look that was uncommon in Australia but more common in the US at the time. And he was between 40 to 50 years of age. He apparently had very defined calf muscles, and his toes were also odd-shaped that met in a wedge-like point. And I know this is a strange thing to mention, but it does lead to a theory that he may have been a dancer, maybe ballet, and we'll be getting back into this a little later. The clothing that the man was wearing when he was found were as follows: brown fawn trousers, white shirt with collar, a tie which was red, white and blue, a brown knitted pullover, a grey-brown double-breasted coat, heavy knitted socks, and brown laced up shoes which were clean and polished, and he was also wearing jockey pants which were slightly soiled. The man was indeed very smartly dressed, maybe too well dressed on this hot sunny day at the start of the Australian summer. Another strange detail was that he did not have a hat, and for the time period this is considered strange, as men often finished off their suits with a smart hat. It was also discovered that he had removed the tags from his clothing, and this was apparently a common practice in those days if the clothing had been bought from a second-hand shop, to remove the last owner's name from the clothing. There was also a tear in the gentleman's trouser pocket which had been repaired with an orange piece of thread. Now remember this orange piece of thread, as it is a very important piece of information a little bit later on in the case. The man's smart clothing was searched and pockets and all contents placed out onto a table. The dead man was carrying a railway ticket to Henley Beach unused, a bus ticket, 2 combs, a metal comb and a plastic comb, a handkerchief, a part packet of juicy fruit chewing gum, a box of Bryant and May's matches, a quarter full, an Army Club cigarettes packet containing 7 Kensington's brand cigarettes, which were actually a more expensive brand of cigarette than the actual packet he carried them in. And like I said before, he had no wallet and no cash and no ID. The police were at a loss, and the autopsy did very little to uncover any more clues. It was noted that the man had dribbled down his chin upon dying, which did tell them that he was unable to swallow. His pupils were said to be smaller than normal, which was unusual but not unheard of, and his spleen was very large and firm, and his liver was full of congested blood. In the man's stomach his last meal was discovered, which was a pasty, which was also surrounded by a lot of blood, which also pointed towards poisoning, but upon testing the food there was no sign that the poison was in his last meal. Despite all of this, no cause of death was found and poisoning could not be proven. There was one theory that the man had been poisoned by a very rare poison that would have disappeared from the body very soon after death. A gentleman named Sir Cedric Stanton Hicks had testified in court that this may be the case, and he could think of 2 poisons that may have been used, but they were so dangerous he refused to name them in front of people in open court. These poisons were digitalis and strophanthin. The police, now completely baffled and at a loss, took the man's fingerprints and sent them not only across Australia but all over the world. And people were invited to come and see the body, mainly people involved in missing persons cases, and still nothing was discovered. As the new year came in and police now found themselves in January and still no leads or ideas on who the man was, they called out for anyone to report anything unusual that they may have discovered around the date of the man's death, and they now believe that he may have been a visitor to the city or indeed Australia. So what they really wanted was any abandoned belongings such as luggage, which meant contacting lost property buildings, train stations and hotels. But this was a stab in the dark. But it paid off at last. They actually found something. On the 12th of January, Adelaide railway station contacted the police about an abandoned suitcase that had been left in the cloakroom on November the 30th, the day the Somerton man was first spotted on the beach. The staff at the railway station had no memory of the person who left the case and had no memory of who it was, so this case could have been anyone's, but they did find a few clues inside the case which suggested that it did indeed belong to the Somerton man. Now, do you remember the orange piece of thread that patched up the inside of the man's pocket that I mentioned earlier? Well, apparently this thread was actually quite rare and was not sold in Australia, so it was quite amazing when the police opened up the suitcase and found more of that unique orange thread. And here are a few of the other contents in the case. A red checked dressing gown, a size 7 red felt pair of slippers which fit the dead body, 4 pairs of underpants, pyjamas, shaving items, a light brown pair of trousers with sand in the cuffs, and for some reason this sand was not tested or looked into, and an electrician's screwdriver, a table knife which had been cut down into a smaller blade, a pair of scissors with sharpened points, a small square piece of zinc thought to have been used as a protective sheath for the knife and scissors, and a stenciling brush as used on merchant ships for marking cargo. If this is true, the Somerton man could have well been a sailor, and this may explain the sand in the trousers. There was also airmail stickers, which suggested he was in contact with someone overseas, and just like the clothing he was wearing, all identification marks on the clothes in the case had been removed, apart from some that the police found. The name T. Keane, Keane, was found on a tie. The name Keane, Keane, was found on a laundry bag, and the name Keane, spelt Kean without the E on the end, was found on a singlet. It has been suggested that the man either failed to remove all the tags, or there was more to this man's death than met the eye. Maybe someone else, a sinister character perhaps, didn't feel the need to remove these tags because they knew that this was not the Somerton man's real name if they were trying to cover up his identity after murdering him. And of course the police looked into the name Keane, but unfortunately they didn't find anything. The clothing also had some numbers that are believed to have been placed there from a dry cleaning service. Despite all these new clues to the man's identity, it was all hopeless. The police had no idea who the Somerton man was. 4 months after the Somerton man was found, another inspection of the body and clothing was done, and this time something was found that was missed the first time around. It was believed that the Somerton man's clothing had been checked thoroughly, but upon this inspection, a scrap of paper was found inside a small pocket on the waistband of the trousers, which could possibly have been used for holding a pocket watch. This scrap of paper was about to add so much more mystery to an already mysterious case, and although it would bring so much more baffling information, it would also provide very little answers. The torn piece of paper was removed very carefully from the man's pocket and unrolled to reveal the printed text which read, "Tamam Shud." Now, at first the police were baffled by what this word meant, but it wasn't long before someone pointed out that it was a Persian phrase, and translated it roughly meant "it is ended." And after some more investigations, it was revealed that this piece of torn paper was actually from the book The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Now, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam is actually a collection of Persian poems which was translated into English in 1859 by Edward Fitzgerald. And the police had no problem finding copies of this book in many different editions, but this did not really help the case. The font on the paper found in the Somerton man's pocket was very different to the editions that the police have found so far. It would seem that this font had come from a very rare edition of the Rubaiyat. So now it would seem that there was a whole new aspect to this case, And was this message meant to be found, which translated roughly into the phrase, "It has ended"? Was this a clue that the death was a suicide? Unfortunately, this bit of evidence brought forward held no answers. The body was now starting to decompose and needed to be buried, but not before a plaster cast bust was made from the corpse of the head and the upper torso. That was intended to be used to help identify the man should some friend or family member come forward and provide any help in solving the case. The coffin was buried under concrete and placed in dry ground somewhere it was possible to recover with ease if needed. And so, with the body of the Somerton man now laid under the ground, investigations went on, but progress was non-existent. That is until the 23rd of July, a whole 8 months after the body was found, when a gentleman whose name was never made public handed in a copy of a book that he believed may help the police with their investigations. And you guessed it, this copy of the book was a Rubaiyat. And this copy of the book also matched the font from the scrap of paper that would seem to have been torn from this very edition. When the police questioned the gentleman on where he came across the book, he explained it had been in his car, but it was by no means his book. He explained that he often parked his car near Somerton Beach, and the previous December, just after the dead body had been discovered, himself and brother-in-law had gone for a ride in the car. The brother-in-law had noticed a book lying there on the floor below the back seat, but each man believed the book belonged to the other, and without speaking a word to each other, it was placed in the glove compartment, and there it stayed for 8 months. Until the gentleman's attention was drawn to the Somerton case when he heard the police were looking for a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. All of a sudden it dawned on him that he may have in his possession the book that the police were looking for. He ran out to his car, opened the glove compartment and pulled out the book and flipped it to the very last page to find that a part of the page had been torn away, possibly the piece the police had in their possession. And so the book was handed over to the police, and the torn page did indeed come from this book, and they also discovered something else on the book, a handwritten phone number. This is where the story gets really strange. After the police did a little bit of digging, they found that the number belonged to a nurse, and she lived very close to where the body was found, actually within walking distance. When she was questioned on how her number had been found on this book, she informed the police that she was actually a fan of this book and had once given a copy of this book to a man who was an Australian army lieutenant who she met during the war, and his name was Alfred Boxall. Finally, they had a name. Was Alfred Boxall the Somerton man? Well, no, he wasn't. When the police thought they had a lucky break, it was once again taken away from them. Alfred Boxall was alive and well, and he actually still had a copy of the book which was given him by the nurse. The last page was still intact. It is believed that the two may have been in a relationship, and the book was given as some kind of romantic gesture. The nurse also signed it Jestin, which was not a real name, along with a verse from the book, possibly one of her favourite poems. But this still did not explain why the copy of the Rubaiyat that was in the police possession had the nurse's phone number upon it, which was found in the back of somebody's car, with a portion of the last page ripped from it, which was found in the trouser pocket of a dead man on Somerton Beach. The police had to go back to this nurse and ask her more questions, and one of the questions would be if she noticed anything unusual around the time of the man's death. The nurse had very little to give them, but what she did tell the police was that the previous year she was informed by one of her neighbours that a mysterious man had come knocking at her door looking for her. But apart from this, the nurse insisted that she had no idea why her phone number had found its way upon that copy of the book. And so the police decided to take the nurse to see the plaster cast bust of the dead man, to see if she could identify him, and apparently when she saw the Somerton man's death mask, her reaction was a strange one. She seemed to be taken aback, and looked as though she was going to faint, so much so in fact that a detective in the room stepped forward to catch her. When she was asked if she knew the man, she was insistent that she did not, and she refused to look at the cast again. Her gaze stayed down, firmly at the ground. It's worth mentioning that the police may have gone easy when investigating the nurse, as she was very embarrassed by the whole thing. Apparently she was worried that the man she was with would hear about the connection with the book and Alfred Boxall, and possibly the Somerton man. But she always insisted that she did not know him, and she also requested that she remain unnamed, as being connected to the case could bring embarrassment upon her, and the police respected her wishes and she remained unknown for many years. As well as a phone number being found on the book, the police also found another clue. Under ultraviolet light, they found 5 lines of jumbled letters, which seemed to be some kind of code. The police at once had this code sent out to naval intelligence and to well-known code breakers, but unfortunately the code proved unbreakable. It was even printed in the press, but there was no luck. But to this day the code is still considered unbreakable, but that does not mean that many homemade sleuths are not trying. And so the mystery went on. Who was the Somerton man? Many believe he was an American spy that met his end when he was killed by the enemy, possibly poisoned. Some believe he was a jilted lover. Unfortunately, we will never know, but there are a few theories, and my favourite includes the suspicious nurse who remained nameless for so long. And as well as not revealing the lady's name, all evidence that has been collected on this case has all mysteriously disappeared over the years, and only photographs remain. Even the copy of the Rubaiyat has disappeared, and it is said that is the only copy in existence, because no other copy like it has ever been found. It would seem that the investigations on the Somerton man had come to a dead end. He was given his own headstone, which read the following: "Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach 1st of December 1948. And with that, the Somerton case became a cold case. It would seem that nobody was ever going to solve the mystery of the Somerton man. That is until an ex-detective named Jerry Feltis took on the cold case for himself and made a breakthrough in 2002. Now, Jerry Feltis is actually the author of The Unknown Man, which is said to be the best book on the Somerton Man case. So naturally, I try to buy it. Every time I start an episode, I always want to get the best research I can, so I track down the best book on that case. And it just so happened that this book, The Unknown Man, was that book. After a quick Amazon search, I found a copy. The only problem was, it cost £300, and that was for a used copy. In total, I found 2 copies of the book on Amazon, and they were both priced £300, which was slightly outside of my research budget. So as you can imagine, there they stayed. I couldn't find any digital copies of this book anywhere, but it is considered to be the best book on the Somerton Man case, and if you just so happen to have a copy, you're sitting on a small fortune. So when Jerry was assigned the case, the first thing he wanted to do was discover the identity of the nurse. But this was impossible, right? It had been far too long. There was no way he could actually discover the identity of this woman. Well, there was one way, and he actually did find her. You see, Jerry may not have known the identity of the nurse, but he did know the phone number, which was written on the front of the Rubaiyat. And with this piece of information, he went to work. Jerry managed to find a very old copy of the phone book from 1947, and he painstakingly went through all of the numbers until he successfully tracked down the nurse in 2002. And her name was Jo Thomas. Well, I think so. This woman seemed to have so many pseudonyms, so many names. I've known her to go by Jo, Jessica, Teresa, and Justin, and believe me, it was an absolute headache trying to find her actual real name. I've come to the conclusion that her real name was actually Jo or Jessica. For this episode, I'm settling on Jo Thompson. So, doing some fantastic detective work, Jerry actually succeeded in contacting Jo Thompson, and I think he spoke to her a total of 2 times on the phone, and apparently each time she was very evasive. Jerry quickly came to the conclusion that the nurse and the Somerton man definitely did know each other. What he also discovered was that she liked to move around a lot, as if she was running away from something. But for now, he kept her name a secret. Even though he was given permission from the family, he kept it to himself. In 2009, Derek Abbott, a university professor, started working on the case with Jerry, but unfortunately, they had a falling out, and Derek went out on his own to attempt to solve the case, bringing in a team of people from the University of Adelaide to help crack the code, a great challenge for his students and himself. But one thing Derek did not have was Joe Thompson's identity. You see, Jerry refused to give it to him. He promised to keep it a secret, and a secret he kept it. But Abbott was also some kind of super sleuth, and he did actually manage to track Joe Thompson down, but he was saddened to find that she had sadly passed away 2 years previously. And so his next step was to ask about any children that she may have had, and she did indeed have a daughter and a son, but he was especially interested in the son, Robin Thompson. But apparently by the time Derek had actually tracked down Robin, he was very saddened to find that he had actually died as well. Now, the reason Derek was so fascinated by Robin is that he bore an uncanny resemblance to the Somerton Man, which became apparent when you put a picture of the Somerton Man and Robin side by side. But there was also one other piece of information that absolutely amazed Derek. You see, it would seem that Robin had had a full career being a ballet dancer. Now, if you remember, the Somerton Man was thought to have been a dancer, possibly ballet, due to his defined calf muscles and wedge-shaped feet. And like I said before, there are some similarities between the facial features of the Somerton Man and Robin, such as the shape of the ears, which were very, very similar. Somerton Man had earlobes that did not hang down, but they were attached to the face, and Robin's ears were just the same, which was apparently a genetic trait. And then there's the teeth. The Somerton Man was missing his lateral incisors, the teeth that sit either side of the front teeth, and so was Robin. This is an amazing occurrence, and it is also another genetic trait. So the next step would be a DNA test, but Robin had been cremated, so unfortunately a DNA test was out of the question. And so the next question was, did Robin have children? And he did. He had a daughter. A lady named Roma Egan was Robin's partner, and they met at ballet school. And when they were young, they had a baby girl, but unfortunately the pregnancy was an accident and they did not feel they could look after the child and gave her up to adoption. The little girl was called Rachel Egan, and she would grow up with another family, and this bit I find especially amazing. Rachel actually had a very strong passion for dance, especially ballet. I find this especially amazing since she never knew her real parents, and she never knew that her real parents did ballet. She just seemed to have this passion. Now, I'm not sure if a love of ballet could be passed down in the genetics, but you have got to admit that is an amazing, amazing coincidence, and I find it truly, poetic. I just think it's beautiful. So, like I said, Rachel never knew her real parents. That is until one day she received a letter from a social worker while she was at university, and this letter told her that she was adopted. And she decided to track down her birth mother, and they actually embraced each other and formed a close bond. One day, Rachel received a letter from Derek Abbott, and in that letter he explained everything, and she was amazed by the story, and they arranged to meet, and meet they did, and went out for dinner. Derek made no secret about what he wanted. He wanted Rachel's DNA, and he wanted to look at her ears, and he wanted to look at her teeth, and she gladly agreed. But there was something else happening here. They were falling in love. And I suppose love really does work in mysterious ways, because as of 2010, they got married, and they now have 3 children together. Unfortunately, the relationship between Rachel and her newfound mother came to an end due to Roma believing that Derek was simply using Rachel to get answers on the Somerton Man mystery. And if that is the case, then I must say that this guy really did commit to his passions by marrying a woman and having 3 kids. I think this is totally ridiculous. I don't think that is what actually happened here. I have no doubt in my mind that they actually just fell in love. And if this is not a prime example of fate, I don't know what is. Derek Abbott's theory is that Joe Thompson and the Somerton Man had a relationship, and they had a child, Robin Thompson. And if this is true, then that means that Rachel is the granddaughter of the Somerton Man. Did the Somerton Man commit suicide after being told he cannot be involved in the baby's life due to Joe Thompson settling down with a new man, which would later become her husband? And then there's a spy theory. Apparently the rumours that Jessica may have also been a spy, along with Alfred Boxell, who actually did work in intelligence during the war. Is it possible all 3 knew each other, and the Rubaiyat book was used as some secret code book between spies? Jo also had a daughter with her husband, Prosper Thompson, and she was named Kate, and she always had her doubts about her mother's honesty. The advertiser quoted Thompson's daughter Kate as saying she had a dark side, a very strong dark side. She said to me she knew who he was, but she wasn't going to let the cat out of the bag, so to speak. So there's always that fear that I thought that maybe she was responsible for his death. The daughter also said during a 16-minute interview that her mother once made a comment on how she could speak Russian, and when she asked her mother how she knew Russian, her mother simply said, "That's for me to know." And she also told her daughter that she had been lying to the police all these years and did indeed know who the Somerton man was, and the only people who knew the truth were higher up than the police. Joe's daughter believed that her mother knew more than she was telling. Had Joe Thompson presented the book to a man she met during World War II after a possible affair? If so, it is possible she knew the Somerton man and presented him with a copy of the book at some point during a romantic relationship, maybe an affair, which resulted in a baby boy, and for whatever reason she did not wish to continue the relationship with the Somerton man. And then there's the so-called statement that was left in 1959, when a witness claims that he saw a man carrying another man over his shoulder on the same day that the Somerton man was found on the beach. Did this hint at murder? Maybe. I've also heard theories ranging from the Somerton man being a sailor to an alien visitor who was waiting for a ride back to his planet. The investigation goes on to this very day, and in 2021 Derek Abbott was successful in having the body exhumed in hopes of discovering who the Somerton man may have been, and one day we may find out. And when that day arrives I will be sure to do an update episode. But until then, Somerton man's death and identity will remain a mystery. But there's one more thing I would like to tell you before we end today's episode. 3 years before the death of the Somerton man in June 1945, a 34-year-old man named George Marshall was found dead in Ashton Park. It was believed that he had been poisoned. The fact that this man's brother was involved in politics have made this death suspicious, and many wondered if there was an assassination rather than a suicide. Especially after a woman was found face down in a bathtub naked with her wrist slit after testifying at the inquest. Oh, and there's one more thing. When the dead body of George Marshall was found, they also discovered an open book laying upon his chest, and the title of that book was The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam.